Dad called me a failure, who would never succeed, so I gave them the ultimate surprise. The words still echoed in her mind like a haunting melody that refused to fade. She remembered the way they had pierced through her chest, sharp and unrelenting, leaving behind an ache so deep it felt permanent. It wasn't just the tone of his voice, cold, dismissive, but the certainty with which he said it, as if her failure was already written in stone, immutable and final. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the cracked wallpaper peeling away from the wall, feeling smaller than ever before. Her father's words weren't new. They were part of a pattern, a refrain she'd heard too many times growing up. But this time, something inside her snapped. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when things started going wrong between them, or maybe wrong wasn't even the right word. Maybe their relationship had always been built on shaky ground, with expectations neither of them could meet. He wanted perfection, straight A's, accolades, trophies lining the shelves. She gave him effort, but effort alone wasn't enough for him. Every mistake became ammunition, every setback proof of her inadequacy. And now, here she was, 23 years old, living back home after yet another failed attempt at making something of herself, according to him. Her latest venture, a small online business selling handmade jewelry, had crumbled under poor marketing decisions and lackluster sales. To her father, it was just another example of why she would never amount to anything. To her, it was heartbreak wrapped in self-doubt. Sitting there in the dim light of her childhood bedroom, surrounded by memories of who she used to be and dreams she no longer believed in, she realized one thing with startling clarity: she couldn't keep letting him define her worth. But how do you prove someone wrong when they've spent your entire life convincing you they're right? The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the blinds. For once, she didn't feel paralyzed by fear or regret. Instead, there was a strange kind of resolve bubbling beneath the surface. A quiet determination to take control of her life, even if it meant starting over completely. She grabbed a notebook from her desk and began scribbling ideas, thoughts, fragments of inspiration that had been floating around in her head for months. This time, she wouldn't let doubt creep in. This time, she would act. Her plan came together slowly, piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle without knowing what the finished picture looked like. At its core was a simple idea: create something meaningful, something that mattered not just to her but to others as well. She thought about all the people she knew who struggled with self-worth, who carried invisible scars from harsh words or impossible standards. What if she could turn her pain into purpose? What if she could build something that helped others see their own value, even when the world tried to tell them otherwise? It started with research. She spent hours poring over articles, watching videos, and reading books about entrepreneurship, branding, and mental health advocacy. She reached out to friends and acquaintances, asking questions and seeking advice. Some were skeptical, warning her not to set herself up for disappointment again. Others encouraged her, reminding her of the creativity and passion she'd always shown, even during her darkest moments. Their support fueled her fire, pushing her to keep moving forward despite the uncertainty. One day, while scrolling through social media, she stumbled across a post from a woman sharing her journey of overcoming adversity. The caption read, "You are more than your failures." Something about those words struck a chord deep within her. They reminded her of her own struggles, yes, but also of the strength she'd found in facing them. An idea sparked in her mind: what if she created a platform where people could share their stories of resilience and triumph? A space where vulnerability wasn't seen as weakness but as power? Excited by the concept, she dove headfirst into bringing it to life. She taught herself basic web design using free online resources, spending late nights hunched over her laptop, tweaking layouts and experimenting with color schemes. She wrote blog posts inspired by her own experiences, pouring her heart onto the page in hopes of connecting with others who might feel the same way she did. She launched social media accounts, posting daily affirmations and motivational quotes alongside personal anecdotes. Slowly but surely, her little corner of the internet began to grow. At first, the response was modest, a handful of likes here, a few comments there. But then something unexpected happened. One of her posts went viral. In it, she shared a raw and honest account of her father's cutting remarks and how they had shaped her sense of self-worth. She ended the post with a challenge: if someone has ever called you a failure, prove them wrong. Start today. Take one step toward becoming the person you want to be. Thousands of people resonated with her message, flooding her inbox with messages of gratitude and solidarity. Strangers began sharing their own stories, opening up about battles with self-doubt, toxic relationships, and societal pressures. Her platform transformed overnight from a personal project into a community of individuals supporting each other through shared struggles. As her audience grew, so did her confidence. She started hosting live Q&A sessions, answering questions about everything from coping mechanisms to career advice. She collaborated with mental health professionals, inviting them to share tips and strategies for building resilience. She even launched a podcast, interviewing guests who had overcome incredible odds to achieve success on their own terms. Each episode reinforced the same message: you are capable of more than you think. Despite her growing success, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that none of it would matter unless she faced the root of her pain, her father. Their relationship remained strained, marked by awkward silences and tense exchanges whenever they crossed paths in the house. He hadn't acknowledged her efforts, nor had he shown any interest in what she was doing. Part of her wondered if he even noticed. Another part feared that he did and simply didn't care. Still, she refused to let his indifference deter her. If anything, it pushed her harder. She poured every ounce of energy into expanding her platform, determined to make it undeniable proof of her capabilities. She secured partnerships with brands aligned with her mission, negotiated sponsorship deals, and invested in professional development courses to sharpen her skills. Her hard work paid off in ways she never imagined. Within 6 months, her website attracted tens of thousands of visitors each month. Her social media following skyrocketed, earning her recognition as an emerging voice in the mental health advocacy space. Offers for speaking engagements and collaborations rolled in, validating her efforts in ways her father's approval never had. Yet, amidst the whirlwind of success, she couldn't ignore the emptiness lingering in her heart. No matter how far she came, no matter how much validation she received from strangers, it didn't fill the void left by her father's rejection. Deep down, she longed for him to see her, not as a failure, but as someone worthy of love and respect. She knew confronting him wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't move forward without addressing the wound that continued to fester. One evening, after returning home from a particularly inspiring event where she'd spoken to a packed auditorium, she found herself standing outside her father's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the faint rustle of papers inside. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently before stepping in. He looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face before settling into his usual stoic expression. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. He gestured for her to sit, though his eyes betrayed a hint of curiosity. She hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts, before launching into the conversation she'd rehearsed countless times in her head. She told him about her journey, the late nights, the setbacks, the breakthroughs. She showed him screenshots of her website's traffic stats, photos from events she'd attended, testimonials from people whose lives she'd touched. She spoke passionately about her vision for the future, about the impact she hoped to make on the world. For the first time in years, she saw a crack in his armor. His gaze softened, just slightly, as he listened to her speak. When she finished, the room fell silent, heavy with unspoken emotions. She waited, holding her breath, unsure of what to expect next. "You've come a long way," he finally said, his voice gruff but tinged with something unfamiliar, pride perhaps? Or maybe just acknowledgement of the truth he could no longer deny. Whatever it wasn't enough. "Not yet." "I'm not done," she replied firmly, meeting his eyes with a resolve that surprised even herself. "This is just the beginning." And with that, she stood up and walked out of the room, leaving him to sit in stunned silence. Little did he know, she had already begun planning the ultimate surprise, one that would leave no room for doubt about who she truly was and what she was capable of achieving. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into preparing for the biggest milestone of her career thus far, a nationwide campaign aimed at empowering young people to embrace their potential. Partnering with schools, community centers, and youth organizations, she designed workshops and seminars focused on fostering self-esteem, goal-setting, and emotional resilience. The centerpiece of the campaign was a documentary series featuring real-life stories of individuals who had defied the odds to pursue their dreams. She worked tirelessly, coordinating logistics, securing funding, and fine-tuning every detail to ensure its success. Meanwhile, tensions at home remained palpable. Though her father's attitude toward her had shifted slightly, he still struggled to fully accept the magnitude of her accomplishments. She caught glimpses of admiration in his eyes, fleeting moments when she thought he might finally understand. But then he'd retreat back into his shell, unable to articulate the pride she so desperately wanted to hear. Undeterred, she pressed on, channeling her frustration into fuel for her ambition. As the launch date approached, excitement buzzed in the air. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying her message to audiences far beyond what she'd initially envisioned. Social media buzzed with anticipation, supporters rallying behind her cause. Even critics who had doubted her abilities in the past began to take notice, their skepticism giving way to reluctant admiration. On the eve of the campaign's debut, she stood backstage at the main event venue, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium, eager to hear her speak. Cameras flashed, reporters jotted notes, and volunteers scrambled to put the finishing touches on the setup. Amid the chaos, she took a moment to reflect on how far she'd come, from the girl who once believed she was destined to fail, to the woman standing on the brink of making history. As she prepared to step onto the stage, she glanced at the front row, where her father sat stiffly, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, their eyes met, and she saw something there, a flicker of hope maybe, or perhaps just curiosity. Whatever it was, it gave her the courage she needed to walk out into the spotlight, ready to deliver the speech of a lifetime. What happened next would change everything, for both of them. The spotlight hit her like a warm embrace as she stepped onto the stage, the hum of the crowd fading into a hushed anticipation. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she felt an unexpected calm wash over her, a quiet certainty that this moment was meant to be. She adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "Tonight, I want to talk about failure, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. Because if there's one thing I've learned on my journey, it's that failure isn't the end, it's often just the beginning." She paused, scanning the audience. Faces looked back at her, some curious, some skeptical, others nodding along as though they already understood what she was about to say. In the front row, her father sat motionless, his eyes locked on her. For the first time, she didn't see judgment in his gaze. Instead, there was something softer, more vulnerable. It gave her strength. "I grew up believing I wasn't good enough," she continued, her words flowing now with a rhythm born of years of pent-up emotion. "I heard those words so many times that I started to believe them myself. You'll never succeed, they told me. And for a long time, I let those words define me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective exhale of recognition. She saw people leaning forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. This was why she had worked so hard, to create a space where others could feel seen and heard. "But here's the thing about being called a failure," she went on, her tone shifting from reflective to resolute. "It forces you to make a choice. You can either let those words crush you, or you can use them as fuel to prove everyone wrong. That's what I chose to do. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to show myself that I am capable of more than anyone ever thought possible." Her voice rose, filling the room with conviction. "And tonight, I'm not just standing here as proof of my own resilience. I'm standing here as proof that none of us are defined by our lowest moments. We are defined by how we rise after we fall." The applause that followed was thunderous, shaking the walls of the auditorium. People stood, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Cameras flashed, capturing the raw emotion etched across her face. But amidst the chaos, her focus remained on one person, her father. When the applause finally subsided, she took a step closer to the edge of the stage, her eyes locking onto his once again. "Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This is for you." For a moment, he looked startled, caught off guard by the directness of her address. Then slowly he nodded, his jaw tightening as though bracing himself for whatever came next. "You once told me I would never succeed," she continued, her voice unwavering. "And maybe, at the time, you believed it. Maybe you were trying to push me to do better, or maybe you were just speaking out of frustration. But whatever your reasons, those words stayed with me. They haunted me. They made me question everything about myself." She paused, letting the weight of her confession settle over the room. "But instead of breaking me, those words became the catalyst for change. They pushed me to dig deeper, to fight harder, to build something meaningful out of the pain. And now I stand here tonight, not to prove you wrong, but to show you that your words don't have to define me. No one's words do." Her father's expression shifted, his stoic facade cracking ever so slightly. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the guilt, the pride, the regret, all swirling together in a storm of unspoken emotion. For the first time, she realized that perhaps he carried his own burdens, his own fears of inadequacy passed down through generations. Maybe his harsh words hadn't been about her at all, but about the pressure he'd placed on himself to raise someone extraordinary. And so, she concluded, her voice softening now, this campaign isn't just about empowering others to overcome failure. It's about forgiveness, for ourselves, and for the people who hurt us without realizing it. Because sometimes, the hardest part of healing isn't proving our worth to the world. It's learning to forgive the ones who doubted us in the first place. The room erupted into applause again, louder this time, as though the audience collectively understood the depth of what she had shared. But she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed solely on her father, who sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time in her life, she saw him not as the man who had broken her spirit, but as a human being grappling with his own flaws. After the event ended, she found him waiting for her backstage. He stood awkwardly, shuffling his feet, unsure of what to say. When she approached him, he opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Finally, he managed to choke out, I didn't know. She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. I know, she replied gently. And that's okay. What matters is what happens next. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound sadness tinged with awe. You're incredible, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry I couldn't see it before. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Thank you, she said simply, knowing that those two words carried more weight than any apology or explanation ever could. They stood there for a moment, suspended in a fragile truce neither of them fully understood yet. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't the end of their journey toward reconciliation. But it was a start, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rewrite the story between them. As they walked out of the venue together, side by side, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she believed it was possible. After all, she had spent her entire life proving people wrong. Why should this be any different? The days that followed the event were unlike any they had experienced before. For the first time in years, there was a palpable shift in the air between her and her father. It wasn't an overnight transformation, decades of tension couldn't dissolve so easily, but it was progress, and that was enough for now. Conversations that once felt strained or non-existent began to take on a new tone. They were hesitant at first, filled with long pauses and careful phrasing, as though both were walking on eggshells, afraid to disrupt the fragile peace they had begun to build. Her father started asking questions about her work, not out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. He wanted to know how she had managed to grow her platform, what inspired her, and where she planned to go next. At first, she found his interest surprising. It was so unlike the dismissive attitude he had shown in the past. But as the days turned into weeks, she realized something profound. He was trying. Really trying. And that effort, however small, meant more to her than she could put into words. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, her father cleared his throat and said, I've been thinking, maybe I should come to one of your workshops. She looked up from the book she'd been reading, startled by the suggestion. You want to attend a workshop? She asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded, looking almost sheepish. I think it might help me understand what you're doing better. Plus, he hesitated, then added quietly, maybe I could learn something too. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The idea of her father sitting among a group of teenagers and young adults, participating in discussions about self-worth and resilience, seemed surreal. But the sincerity in his voice convinced her. Okay, she said finally, smiling softly. I think that's a great idea. The day of the workshop arrived, and she couldn't help but feel nervous. She had led countless sessions before, but this one felt different. Her father's presence loomed large in her mind, not because she doubted his intentions, but because she knew how much this moment mattered, for both of them. As participants filed into the community center, she spotted him near the back of the room, clutching a notebook and pen like a student preparing for an exam. He gave her a quick nod when their eyes met, and she offered him a reassuring smile before turning her attention to the rest of the group. The workshop focused on reframing failure as a stepping stone rather than a stopping point. She shared stories from her own life, weaving in anecdotes from others who had overcome adversity. When it came time for group activities, she encouraged everyone to share personal experiences of setbacks and how they had grown from them. To her surprise, her father raised his hand during the discussion portion. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Clearing his throat, he began, "I used to believe that success was measured by achievements, grades, awards, titles. If you didn't meet those standards, I thought you were failing. But seeing my daughter stand here today, doing something truly meaningful, it made me realize I was wrong. Success isn't about perfection. It's about growth, about becoming the best version of yourself, even when things don't go as planned." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Around the room, heads nodded in agreement, but her focus remained solely on him. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she listened to him speak, his voice trembling with vulnerability. This was the man who had once called her a failure, the same man who now stood before a room full of strangers, admitting his mistakes and acknowledging her worth. When the session ended, several participants approached her father to thank him for sharing his story. Some admitted they had parents who sounded eerily similar to him, while others expressed gratitude for his honesty. Watching him interact with them, she saw a side of him she had never known existed, compassionate, open-minded, willing to listen. Later that night, as they drove home, she broke the silence. "Thank you for coming today," she said softly. "It meant a lot to me." He glanced at her briefly before returning his gaze to the road. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "I needed to hear those things, not just for you, but for myself too." Over the following months, their relationship continued to evolve. They weren't perfect, old habits occasionally resurfaced, and there were moments when frustration bubbled to the surface. But they worked through it, slowly learning to communicate in ways that healed rather than harmed. Her father even became a regular attendee at her workshops, offering insights from his own journey of self-reflection. Together, they discovered that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about finding new ways to move forward. Meanwhile, her campaign gained momentum, reaching audiences far beyond what she had initially imagined. Schools across the country implemented her curriculum, and her documentary series premiered to critical acclaim. People from all walks of life reached out to share how her message had impacted them, inspiring her to dream even bigger. But perhaps the most unexpected development came when her father suggested they write a book together. "Not just about your story," he explained, "but about ours. About how we got here, and what we've learned along the way." At first, she was hesitant. Writing a book required vulnerability, and revisiting painful memories wasn't something she took lightly. But the more they talked about it, the more she realized it could be a powerful opportunity, not just for them, but for anyone struggling with similar challenges. They spent countless hours drafting chapters, debating perspectives, and reflecting on lessons learned. It was hard work, often bringing old wounds to the surface, but it also deepened their bond in ways neither of them had anticipated. By the time the manuscript was complete, they had created something extraordinary, a testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the transformative power of second chances. On the day of the book launch, she stood beside her father as cameras flashed and reporters fired off questions. Holding a copy of their book, she looked out at the crowd and felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the success they had achieved, but for the journey that had brought them here. "This is for anyone who has ever been told they aren't enough," she said during her speech. "And for anyone who has ever said those words without realizing the weight they carry. We are all works in progress, capable of change if we choose to embrace it." As the applause echoed around them, she turned to her father, meeting his gaze with a smile. In that moment, she knew they had given each other the ultimate gift, redemption. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, she faced it with unwavering hope. After all, they had already proven that even the deepest wounds could heal, with time, effort, and love.